The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question for the United States is what's in our national interest.
My name is John, and the International Criminal Court is back in session. It is June 30th, 2026, and today we're going to look at the situation in Ukraine once again. And before I go any further, I just want to make this very, very clear that I will not be using Syriac for today's video because of major inaccuracies on the front line that literally are just not true. I think he's being a little too favorable right now to the armed forces of Ukraine, when in reality the situation is far more complex than that. But with that all being said, let's get into it and start off with the Zaporizhzhia direction. Now, first of all, the Russian army, via the Group of Forces East, or Vostok, have captured the village of Novoselivka from the armed forces of Ukraine, and after that, they have advanced further, and it is safe to assume right now, based on information provided by Zoka on Telegram, that the village of Yehorivka is largely in a gray zone. And if the Russians are able to capture Yehorivka, then Almanek here will be exposed. And that will mean that the northern road going into the town of Arehov will be cut off. Thus, little to no more supplies for the armed forces of Ukraine's garrison in this strategic and well-defended town. They will be cooked there. And then going a little further to the north, we have a very complicated situation that has caused me to put this area here in a gray zone. Rivne was claimed to be captured by the Russians, but the problem, though, is Vostok didn't send in their flag wavers. And sorry if the map is lagging, crappy internet connection, or maybe it's on Google's end. But anyway, it's loaded up now. Vostok claimed capture of Rivne, but the problem, though, is that there were no flag wavers in any part of the village. So, yeah, I'm going to put that in a gray zone, along with Lisne. Same thing. So, let's assume, for now, that the capture of these two villages is for real, okay? Then the next logical step of the Russians would then be to take the strategic village of Lyubetsky. And should this fall, the road to Arehov from the north, like further to the north, that is, will be completely cut off. Like, Ukrainians within Arehov would have, like, nowhere to go. I think then Russia can advance further southward towards Arehov, or they can advance further northwards. Towards the strategic town of Novomykhailivka. Not to be confused, I think, with the one in Donetsk region, which was right outside of the, infamous town of Ugledar here. But yeah, that was a heavy battle, if you guys remember that. But yeah, Novomykhailivka is one of the major areas within Zaporizhzhia region that are still under Ukrainian control. And should Russians ever reach this, then they will have a pathway towards the city of Zaporizhzhia from the east towards the west. They will not have to attack it from the south. Now also, I'm going to go a little further towards the west, by the way. This area is not, again, clear enough. But what we can definitely conclude here is that the Ukrainians do have majority control over Stepnogorsk, but Primorsk and Plavny, I don't know. I believe the Russians may have repelled the Ukrainian attack into Plavny, but in Primorsk, it's not clear. I'm going to side with Deep State for once and say that this is a gray zone here. I'm sorry. But yeah, all this is gray zone. Ukrainians don't control the whole town, at least yet, but we can definitely assume that they're giving the Dnieper group their hard time. So yeah, good news for the Russians in Zaporizhzhia region one way or another, though obviously there's still a lot of work to do. In the Dnipropetrovsk direction, Again, we got a very complicated situation here. As all of you know, Syriac put a lot of this area in blue for the armed forces of Ukraine. And based on the recent news that has come out from the Russian side, and especially from some people that I talk with on Telegram that are Russian themselves and know some of the guys on the front, that map that Syriac AMK Playfair put out, not true. Like, far from the truth. And the real situation here is just an absolute mess. The Ukrainians and the Russians seem like they like picking at each other and just run into random villages and empty fields like a bunch of baboons, which of course gets many of them killed. And as a result, the Russians have recently captured, well, allegedly, the villages of Pisanci, Novosky, Liuvate, and Bogodorivka, right here. Combine that with Dobropillovo, it is safe to assume, at least according to this gray zone, that the Russians are at least right outside of the city or town of Pokrovsky, Little Pokrovsk, within the Dnipropetrovsk region. And they're also outside of the strategic town of Alexandrovka. Now, here's the test. If the Russians are not lying about capturing all these villages here, that would mean Alexandrovka is next on the chopping block. And if Vostok claims Alexandrovka under their control, then maybe we can start painting a lot of these areas in red. Like, it would be a huge credibility blow to many mappers, especially the ones that I have good ties with, left and right. But yeah, if Alexandrovka falls to the Russian army, then yeah, a bunch of these guys are definitely going to get ridiculed by their audience. And maybe accuse them of being propagandists for the Kiev regime and their cronies or something like that. But yeah. Though I will say right now, I do believe Oristopol and all these villages here are under Ukrainian control. At least that's the conclusion I made. But here, though, for instance, I don't know. So I'm going to put in the gray zone. So yeah, nothing really changed here. It looks like Russians have stabilized situation for now, outside of Komar. Novopavlovka, no changes. No changes here that much too in the direction of Sergivka and the border with Dnipropetrovsk on the E50 road. And then here's where things get really interesting. So Z Committee, who is like one of the most liked sources in the pro-Russian circle, generally known for how quite reliable they are, they have reported that the Group of Forces Center of the Russian army have broken into the city of Dobropillyya, or Dobropolye. They have broken through from the village of Novy Donbass, and allegedly Steppe, but I'm not really convinced they captured that, so I'm putting a gray zone just in case. You know, because I don't want to look like a total jackass in the event that none of this is true, but allegedly the Russians advanced from Novy Donbass into Dobropolye, and they are already in the eastern part of the city. Fighting is ongoing there, and if this report is to be confirmed, then obviously the armed forces of Ukraine are in big trouble. Because if Dobropillyya were to fall to the Russian army, if ever, then we can essentially start the countdown of the collapse of the remainder of Ukrainian-controlled Donetsk region. From Dobropillyya, they can then head for the town of Belozerske here. And then further up north, they would then be reaching the town of Novodonetsky. And then from Novodonetsky, you'll be Alexandrovka, which was like one of the many locations that Simon of Vice News, he no longer works there, by the way, he's now like a mainstream journalist, that is, went to. So, yeah, we can basically then start the countdown of north and western Donetsk region collapsing to the Russians. And then also, if Dobropillyya is secured, then nothing is also going to stop the Russians from entering Dnipropetrovsk region from the northeastern side. So, I assume what might happen is that all these gains here alleged gains would be nothing in compared to what would happen in Dobropillyya Falls. Like, I think there would be far more Russian control over these areas within Dnipropetrovsk region, at least in this part, more than what they control outside of the Gulay-Pulay direction. So yeah, let's see what happens though. Will the armed forces of Ukraine repel the assault, or was this thing totally faked? Time will tell, but assuming that this is true, then yeah, Ukrainians are in big trouble here. They better stop it very quickly, or else Donbas is all but gone for them. Konstantinovka direction, next to no changes, so we can kind of forget about that. In the direction of Slavyansk and the Kramatorsk, I think it is safe to assume that most, if not all, of Malinovka is under Russian control. I only went as far as what the geolocations confirmed, but yeah, Malinovka is now under Russian control, for the most part, that is. And because of that, we can assume that Russians will be within reach of Kramatorsk's suburbs, like by like August or September. They're definitely getting very close to the point where I don't think anyone's going to be residing in the city for much longer. They're going to leave very quickly. Raya Alexandrovka, basically the remainders are being cleared out. And then there's also reports of Russians beginning the bombardment of Mykolaiivka too. This is huge, by the way, because if they capture Mykolaiivka, then Slavyansk will be open from the east. And we also have no changes in Liman direction, though we can assume Ukrainians are still basically on the assault in the northern flank of the city of Liman. And they've had successes there, but I don't know if they're going to be able to sustain those successes for much longer because they're taking heavy casualties. In the Kupiansk direction, not a lot of changes, though what we can assume right now is that Novosinove is being cleared out. I put Glushkovka under Russian control because I just don't think there's any Ukrainians there anymore. I feel like a lot of the information there is a little outdated, if not like honest with how things really are there. And in Kiev Sharifka, Russians definitely control, I would say, half of the commie blocks in the town. And then going to Kupiansk Vuzlove, it is safe to say now that the Russians have broken through in the city center and now control a good chunk of this. So basically, Ukrainians are now cut off here, so there's a pocket here that they're going to have to leave, or maybe this whole area here is no longer under Ukrainian control, and that the mapper should just paint it red. But yeah, it appears Ukrainians' days on the eastern side of the Oska River are coming to a close for real this time, because they're definitely not coming back. The fluke of September-October 2022 is not going to be repeated. Ukrainians have a lot of guys, but the Russians now have more guys. So yeah, and then in the city of Kupiansk itself, little to no changes, though what we can definitely assume is that most of the city center is under their control. But other than that, though, little to no changes. Some fields in the vicinity of Novo-Vasilievka are under their control. And then going into the areas bordering Russia in the Kharkiv region, like in the northeastern Kharkiv region, there is a report that the Russians have broken through to the town of Bily Kolodiez, but there's not enough information available to confirm these claims, once again. So let's take that with a grain of salt. Maybe within a matter of days, within the first week of July or so, I might put it in the gray zone or so, but for now, I'm going to keep it blue here because there's just not enough evidence. No changes in the main Kharkiv direction, though we can definitely assume now with the bombardment of all these gas stations across these two provinces here that it will not be possible for Ukrainians to support their contingents within this area. It's going to get a lot harder, if not next to impossible, now that those gas stations are getting blown up. In the Sumy direction, this will be the last thing we'll cover before we end it for today. The Russians are continuing their advances, and based on what Mosno and some local Russians have been reporting, what you're seeing on this map right now is not the truth, and not in a good way for the armed forces of Ukraine. Apparently, the Russians have already broken through into these forested areas. And as I expected, once the Russians get like right outside the forested areas north of Sumy City, then the Ukrainians are pretty much cooked. They're going to use the forested area as cover for raids and for all sorts of attacks on the city of Sumy, to the point that they make Sumy itself uninhabitable for anybody to live there. Like, people will start leaving in large numbers. Syriac, by the way, does not have this part of evil Zelensky under Russian control. And I think he has it in gray zone or Ukrainian control, but I honestly disagree with him there. And then going a little further to the west, we see that Khotan is about to be contested. And Kendratovka is about to be cleared up by the Russian army. So basically, all the efforts Ukrainians made to clear out the Russians from the Sumy region last summer or so ended up all being for naught. Like, they didn't accomplish anything. So what we can assume will happen now is that Novosich, Kinitsia, and Krapiv Shnaya and Marine, they're all going to fall to Russia easily, along with Sadki. And then what we should expect will happen here is that the Russians will then consolidate their positions along with what they have in DOBROPILLYA direction. And then, yeah, then we'll see the general battle for Sumy. I don't think it's going to be a conventional battle, but rather a very grind, like a long grind fest that will mostly occur in the forested areas. Mosno himself is shocked that they haven't announced the evacuations yet, but they may have to very soon, especially with those gas stations being blown up. And if they don't do anything soon, then obviously, yeah, Ukrainians are probably going to end up losing the city a lot sooner than many people think. And if they were to lose Sumy, that would be the first provincial capital for the Russians to take over since Kherson in March 2022. I don't know if that's likely, but it's not impossible now, especially with the news in Kharkiv region as well. So yeah, that's going to do it for today's video, everybody. I hope all of you found it informative, educational, and somewhat entertaining if you thought it that way. And I'll see you all in a few days from now. So have a happy July, everybody, and I'll see you all next time.